Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Continuous Testing on Emulators using the Espresso Test Automation Framework. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Today you have joined the presentation either listening to your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer, you can join over your telephone. Just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of your control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the session. There is a handout in the control panel as well. Feel free to download the document at any time during today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Clint Sprague. Clint?
Thank you. So welcome everyone to today's presentation. Our goal is to ensure that you get a good understanding of not just the Espresso test automation framework, but also understanding the value of using emulators as well as in combination with your real device testing. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So let's first talk about the challenges of mobile test automation. And for those of you that are doing any type of mobile development or if you're tasked with actually testing any type of mobile apps, I know a lot of people run into many issues. In the three key areas that we see that customers have run into is one, device fragmentation, meaning that there are so many different versions of operating systems and it varies from region to region. So what you'll see is that, and one of the trends that we've noticed over the last couple of years is that most individuals or most consumers aren't updating their devices as quickly as possible. And one of the recent survey or recent data that we have for the most used like iPhone device is actually the iPhone 7. It is not the iPhone 8 or the iPhone 10. Same thing with Android devices. People are using older versions. So you have all these different versions of the operating systems from these different devices that are out on the market. But that makes it difficult for organizations to understand what do I test and how much of that do I test. Also, you have various app types. Of course, you have the mobile web applications, you have hybrid, and you also have native apps, which is what our focus will be with the Espresso test automation framework today. Then, of course, you have users that are geographically dispersed. So different phones or different operating systems are popular in different regions of the world. So in India, the top OS device is the Kai OS device, which is basically a derivative of the Android operating system. So you have all these different users, device fragmentations, and various app types, which makes mobile testing a bit complex. So with that, why would I want to use a test automation framework? Well, the goal of the automation framework is to really simplify how you do your test automation and make it much easier to work within that mobile application, recognize those components, and to be able to build a reliable and robust test automation suite of tests. Now, here, what you see on the screen are three of the most popular test automation frameworks. You have Appium, then you have XC Test, and also XCUI Test, as well as Espresso. There are a ton of automation frameworks out there. You have some additional ones are like Detox, and you have Earl Grey as well. So there are a ton of frameworks for mobile test automation that can be used. But today's focus, of course, is going to be on Espresso. But the goal of using a test automation framework is to make it easier, just like if you're using any type of test automation tool or if you're using an additional framework like Selenium, is to make sure that your testing is much easier to build. It is much more reliable and easier to maintain. So we talked about using, of course, the title of this is using emulators with Espresso. And so a lot of times, and the reason we wanted to really talk about, really focus on this particular topic is that there is a myth in the industry that says if you're using emulators to do your testing, you're not really testing at all. And this just isn't the case. Different organizations need different solutions, and it could be for different reasons. So if you look at some of the benefits of using emulators and simulators, one is, of course, the ability to do massive parallel concurrency for faster build times. So you will be able to spin up as many images or many devices as you can. Now, if you're trying to do this with real devices, a lot of times that can be cost prohibitive because it's going to cost a lot more to be able to spin up real devices. Now, what we're not saying is that you need to use one or the other. Our point of view is that you need to use a combination of real devices, emulators, and simulators to do your test automation. Um, Also, it's going to really help you as you start to implement continuous testing, especially continuous integration and continuous delivery, because you'll be able to easily spin up those emulators to be able to scale those across the board much more, a lot easier than you would if you were working with just real devices alone. But there are benefits of using real devices as well as emulators and simulators. And to build a robust test automation strategy, our point of view is that you need a combination of both. Now, what does this get you? Massive parallel execution at scale. And for a lot of organizations, that's one of the key areas that they need to improve upon is really how do I be able to do more with less? And being able to have a solution where I can launch my test and execute them in parallel. So if you look at this particular example of what scaling your testing platform, what it enables you to do. So you can run your run your tests in parallel to actually speed your releases. It's going to allow you to test more scenarios per unit of time. If you look at this particular example of mobile devices, using MUSIM, a combination of real devices, different OS combinations, running them in a serial mode would take, theoretically, is going to take much longer than if you were able to run them in parallel. So the goal is to allow you to expand your test automation and be able to do more in less time and actually do it correctly in less time as well. So with that, I am going to transition this over to my colleague Chandra, and he's going to talk about Espresso, what it is, how to use it, and also give you a demo of our solution. And with that, I will transfer and pass it on.
Cool. Thank you, Clint. Hello, everybody. My name is Chandra. I'm the product manager for emulators and simulators. Today, I'm going to talk about what is Espresso, how is it different from Appium, and then I'll give you a brief demo of running Espresso tests on SAW simulators. So first, to begin with, what is Espresso? Espresso is a test automation framework from Google. It's targeted at developers to test mobile applications on Android. So, what's the significance of what's meant by targeted developers and how is Espresso different from other test frameworks? Let's take a closer look. I'm going to use a really simple app to help answer these questions. This app is extremely simple. All that it does is it validates user credentials. Given a username and password, it tells you if the credentials are valid, invalid, or if the account is locked. Now imagine that we made some changes to this app and we want to test them. Now we can approach testing this application as an end user, where the whole application and its internals are a completely black box to us. All that we do is interact with the user interface. In this kind of testing approach, you actually need more components in your test infrastructure. You actually have to maintain a valid test user and a locked user somewhere in your infrastructure. And then your test script would provide the credentials and make sure that you get the right results back. Now, what are the pros and cons of this approach? On the positive side, this is very close to a real-world scenario, but there's also some downsides to this. Now, you have a lot of components in your test infrastructure, and every test actually exercises all the components. So they're potentially slow, and there's also good room for flake. Some components may be down. Another approach of testing this simple application is as a developer. As a developer, you're aware of the internals of this application. Now you can say that this change that I made is a really simple one. It only affects the presentation layer. It doesn't touch any other components. Maybe you resize the button, maybe you change some font, and all that you care about is to make sure that your presentation layer works as expected. Now, as a developer, since you know the internals of the app, you can mock all the business logic that actually reaches out somewhere into your infrastructure and validates the credentials. Now, your test script, your mock business logic simply returns the three response types: valid credentials, invalid credentials, or the account is locked. And then you can use the test script to make sure that the presentation layer returns the right results. Now, the advantage of this is that these tests are fast. You don't have any external dependencies, and they're very reliable. On the downside, sure, you're not exercising all the different components in your test infrastructure. Now, the key point I'm trying to make is that both gray box and black box testing are complementary to each other. It's not that one is better than the other. Now, I've used a simple app to kind of illustrate these differences. Now, if you take a real world scenario, like an e-commerce app, which has complex user flows, where you need to sign in, add items to the cart, provide shipment details, and actually check out. In a real world scenario, there can be a lot of errors along each of these steps. Maybe your account is invalid. Maybe the item is out of stock. Maybe the address you provided is invalid, or the payment information is not correct. Running an end-to-end test can be pretty complex, and maintaining it could be pretty expensive too. So gray box testing on something like this, if you made some aesthetic changes, can be very beneficial and provide you results really fast. Now, Espresso can help you with both black box testing as well as gray box testing, because it has access to the application internals. And gray box testing is where Espresso really shines. Now, what does this whole thing mean with respect to your app quality itself? Now, if you think of your application test suite as a test pyramid with a lot of unit tests to test your business logic at the very bottom, and then you have UI functional tests, some UI functional tests in the next layer, and a handful of end-to-end tests that exercise all your components. Now, Appium is great for end-to-end testing, whereas Espresso can help you with both end-to-end as well as gray box. And this is one of the primary differences between Appium and Espresso. Now, with Appium, it is possible to use some additional tools, maybe like a browser map proxy or another proxy, to actually simulate and maybe run some of these gray box unit tests. But Espresso is really cut out for this one thing, gray box UI unit tests. So that's one of the fundamental differentiating factors. Let's take a look at some of the other differences between Appium and Espresso. One of the key differences is platform support. Now, Espresso is primarily for Android only. Appium has actually cross-platform support. It can be used for both iOS and Android. So imagine you have a cross-platform application with a lot of similar UI elements, similar IDs. Then you can potentially use Appium, a same script, to test both your iOS version of the app as well as the Android version of the app. And again, it depends on your app. Another difference is with Espresso, Espresso is only for mobile apps, a native app or a hybrid app. You cannot use it to test mobile web, whereas Appium can be used for mobile web as well as mobile apps. Another differentiating factor is language support. You can use a lot of different languages, a lot of the popular languages to write your Appium test script, whereas Espresso either has to be in Java or in Kotlin. Another important factor is speed of execution. Getting results fast, getting the feedback fast is a really critical thing while testing your app. Now, on my local emulator, the same test, the Espresso test, ran twice as fast as an Appium test. Now, when you move your Appium tests into the cloud, or you're leveraging some infrastructure, it does slow down the test a little bit because of just the way Appium works under the hood. So in these situations, Espresso is much more faster than Appium. It could be up to 4 or even 5x faster than Appium. Another key thing to keep in mind is test synchronization. What I mean by that is making sure that your test script or the UI actions performed in your test script are in sync with your application under test. or the state of your application. Now, in Appium world, this is a bit of a challenging problem. The test developers have to wrestle with explicit waits or implicit waits to make sure that the UI actions actually happen at the right time. Now, Espresso, all of this is taken care of by the framework. The developers don't have to deal with any of this complexity. So there's a variety of differences. The key differentiating factor between Espresso and Appium is definitely Espresso support for gray box testing, but there are other things like script portability. Appium scripts can be used across iOS and Android, and there's a lot of different languages that you can use for Appium. Speed is a primary factor. So which one to use, how to complement, leverage Espresso and Appium, really depends on your QA team structure and maybe to some amount your QA process and your application architecture. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump into and show you how to run Espresso tests on sauce simulators. So at a very high level, this is how the solution works. So if you want to run any tests on sauce simulators, Espresso tests on sauce simulators, you need to use this application called Sauce Runner Virtual. And to this application, you provide the application under test, the Espresso test suite itself, and a list of emulators on which you want to test. And what the application does is it uploads both the application under test as well as the Espresso test suite into Sauce, installs them on all the emulators, and executes the test suite in parallel on all the emulators. And once the tests are complete, it returns the results, and then it exits with a special status code that lets you find out if the entire test suite succeeded or if it failed. So for this demo, I'm going to use a really simple app. So all that it says is when you provide a name and click say hello, it says hello John or hello Dave. It only has two states. So if you don't provide a name, it says please enter a name. Otherwise, if you gave it a name, it would say it has a bug in it. Instead of saying hello, it says bye. So I'm going to test this app. So as I mentioned, I need to use this application called Sauce Runner Virtual, and I provided my user credentials, and then I'm running an Espresso test, and these are the emulators I want to run it, test it on, a Galaxy S9 and a Pixel C, and I provided my application on the test suite itself, and that's how I run it. Okay, test is started. Okay, all right, so I can see that my test has started. So first I should be able to see the video of the test. These tests are pretty simple. There's only two test methods in it, so it'll probably complete pretty fast. Give it a few seconds for the video to load. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, it's a very simple test. While the video was loading, the test actually completed. So let's take a look at what the results look like. So if you go to the test methods, here is the test suite that I ran, and it only has two tests in it. One, it tests for the condition where I pressed the hello button without a name in it, and that passed. And the other test that makes sure that when you provided a valid name, it says hello John or hello John. So here that failed because the app actually returns says bye instead of hello. So in this case, I get the full call stack that will help me identify where the issue is. Now, if I want, I can go ahead and watch the video for the entire test session, or I can go to the logs and look at the instrumentation log, or I can use the instrumentation log. I can look at the device log, or I can pull up the JUnit XML and feed it into my JUnit plugin or into my reporting framework. So that's in a nutshell how Espresso on emulators works. What else do we have on our roadmap? So in this next quarter, we're planning on adding screenshots for failed tests, and we're also going to launch XUI, a beta support for XUI tests on simulators. And going forward, in the in the first half of 2019, we're planning to speed up Espresso and XUI test execution to test level parallelization. Cool. That's all I had, and now we can switch to Q&A.
Sure. Thank you, Chandra. We do have a few questions. From Chris, he writes, for a beginning programmer, would you recommend Java or Kotlin to use with Espresso?
I've dabbled with Kotlin, and I've used Java a little bit. From what I heard, Kotlin has inherent support for some of the code patterns or the design patterns, and it might be easier to actually use Kotlin for a beginning programmer.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And then Beth, hello Beth, right? So would Espresso be recommended for a production sanity test?
Definitely. So it depends on how you organize what you plan to run in sanity. So if your goal is to run a gray box test where you're as an initial sanity check where you're mocking some of the backend components, yes, you could definitely do that. Yeah. Even if you were to run an end-to-end test, Espresso is still faster than Appium. But yes, as a part of the production sanity check, if you're basically running some checks to make sure that some front-end components work as expected through some gray box testing, yes, that would be a great way to get some initial feedback.
Okay. Larry writes, is there a good spot to get a list of the available emulators and API levels?
Sure. Maybe, Larry, you're talking about the emulators and the supported Android versions or the Android API versions. Yes, there is. If you Google for SOS platform configurator, it takes you to a page that lets you generate. It basically provides you a list of all the SOS emulators and simulators that are supported, along with the iOS or Android version supported on each of those emulators.
Excellent. We had an earlier question that was pre-submitted, and that is for the mobile app I support should be tested on multiple platforms. So just wondering if Espresso platform-centric is just to Android, or could it be used for iOS as well? I know we addressed this, but you can reinforce the point.
Right. So definitely. So Espresso is only for Android. So if you have, so Espresso test rate is only to test your application on Android and not on iOS.
We also had a question about public versus private cloud. So I'll put it out there. Can you address public versus private cloud? Will Appium tests run close to Espresso speeds on a private cloud instance?
So there's two reasons why Espresso is much faster. Maybe there's one primary reason that Espresso is much faster than Appium. Espresso test suite is executed directly on the device, right next to the application of the test. Whereas Appium, the script itself executes inside your network on a test system, and the commands are actually sent all the way over to the phone or the device that's actually executing somewhere in the cloud. So every UI command has a round trip. It needs to execute on the device, and then the next command needs to go over to the device in the Appium world. So Appium under the hood, just because of the way it works, will never be as fast as a comparable Espresso test.
Okay, and I think this is related, although maybe a little tougher to project, but will the application run faster in simulator emulator compared with real device? And if not, is there an approximation of the difference between the
Sure.
speed of the test?
Sure. So we've looked into that a little bit. Now with Android 7.0, any emulators that you use 7.0 and 7 and above, they're exactly as fast as a real device. So we haven't yet looked into, so again, Espresso is only for emulators. So the part about simulators is not really applicable in this discussion.
Okay. Here's a question. When you provide the APK, should that be located on the server?
Great. So when you run SOS Runner Virtual, the APKs, both the application under test APK and the Espresso APK, could be in the local on the local system, or they can be URLs to some place that's hosted in your internal network or on the public network.
Okay. Larry asked a follow-up question, and that is to find a list of the real devices that we have.
Yes. So at the moment, you do have to go into the source user interface, and then if you go to manual or live testing, you can see the full range of all the devices and the real devices and the corresponding operating systems. We are working on an effort. Yeah, so that's the best place to get a list of all the real devices.
Okay. Let me see if I could do this. Again, Manoj is writing simulator and emulator real device combination. What is the difference in the real world scenario with respect to the application? And I guess this would really kind of go to the pros and cons that Clint showed on the test pyramid, when to use real devices, when to use emulators and simulators.
Yeah, yeah.
But is there a way to kind of
size
that?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple of different ways to look at it. In general, there's some hardware capabilities that are only present on a real device, like maybe a Bluetooth emulation. There's a certain functionality that's only available on a real device. So if you want to make sure that corresponding app functionality works as expected, then you definitely have to test your app at least once during the release cycle and on a real device and make sure that it works as expected. But so if you look at the release cycle where maybe you have a 2-week sprint or maybe you have a 1-week sprint. So early on in the dev cycle, everybody is making changes, and you want did it cause any issues? So that's where you can leverage emulators. Emulators are always available. So you don't have to worry about a real device being available at that instant in the public cloud. So emulators are always available and they're super scalable. So you can get really fast feedback. Now, and you can incorporate real devices as needed. So if you definitely want to make sure that at the end of the day, your application works as expected on those devices that your customers are using. So you definitely want to maybe once a day or maybe a couple of times a day or maybe once a release, you can plan that out and make sure that your application works as expected on the real device, on the real devices. I hope that answers.
That's great. Thank you. Does Espresso testing work with the release APK?
Right. So on Java, when you create APKs, as long as the APK doesn't have any device, what I mean is ARM specific. You can have certain libraries in your application that are really specific to a real device in certain scenarios. For the most part, though, most apps they don't really have that real device specific code. So for any of those, yes, you can take the same app that you use on real devices or in production and put it on an emulator and actually test it. But if it has any of this ARM or CPU dependencies, then yes, it won't work on emulators.
All right. And here's an open-ended question: what are the most common issues when using Espresso?
Common issues when using Espresso. Gosh, I only thought about all the positive things when using Espresso. Well,
I don't know if it'd be an issue, but again, it might be somewhat of the limitation that, obviously mobile web is not something that you can do with Espresso.
Yeah, definitely, if you want to do any gray box testing, you definitely need to have some insights into what your app is, into how your app is structured. So if most of your tests are developed by a QA team that doesn't have any insights into it, then that could be a hurdle. Other than that, Espresso is only for Android. And as Bill mentioned, you cannot really test mobile web. Other than that, I don't know if there's a strong drawback.
I know Appium certainly supports a pretty healthy community forum. Is there a community for Espresso? Well, the community forum.
So Espresso is backed by Google, and it is a pretty strong. There's a lot of people with a strong interest in Espresso.
Okay. Here is, can you test coverage report using Espresso?
Yes, you can definitely do that. There is an option, so that's something that we don't support yet on SOS, but there is a coverage report that you can generate while running Espresso tests.
All right. Manoj asks, when compared with BlackBox and GrayBox with Espresso, which holds the best?
Okay, so again, this BlackBox and GrayBox, they're complementary to each other. To get fast feedback, you need to use both of them. BlackBox has this advantage that you're testing the application as an end user and you're exercising all the components in the full pipeline. BlackBox is again testing individual components in isolation, making sure that they work as expected, and the benefit of that is fast feedback. So I wouldn't say one is better than the other. You need to use both of them. And each has its pros and cons, and then they both are complementary to each other. You need to use both.
Very good. Well, that does it for our questions. So we'll end a bit early here, but thank you all for attending. We will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's presentation. You can always reach out to us at hello@Sauce Labs, or if you're a Sauce Labs customer, send your ticket to support@saucelabs.com. And we will be releasing some additional information around this, but I thank everyone for attending today. And Chandra and Clint, thank you very much for your time and good work. We'll see everybody on the internet.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.